Good morning, everybody. My presentation is about the policy of women entrepreneurship in the MENA region. How do we connect the women entrepreneurship with development? Well, development theories, or the modern theories of economic development, actually stress the significance of the human capital in economic development and the role of ideas and new products in the market. For this human capital to work, to be an engine of growth in economic development, we have to have efficient institutions and rewarding incentives, etc. And the literature derives some successful examples from Germany, Italy, South Korea, about the role of the entrepreneurship in the economy. Developing countries and MENA as well started to follow or apply the same models of development that the developed countries have succeeded in. And one of them is to encourage the small and medium enterprises, or the micro and small medium enterprises. However, the starting point between the developed countries and developing countries is different. So let me start with one of the first differences. I'm referring to developed countries as the West and developing and MENA countries as the imitators. In the West, when they started their development or they adopted the small and medium enterprises, it was an essential part of their planning or economic development planning. It was an integrated instrument of local and regional growth. Funds were made available to clusters of networks that vertically or horizontally integrated with the entire economy. Developing countries and MENA do not have this connection. Small and medium enterprises in the region are disconnected, and they are competing against each other, and they are not perceived by the government or the local or the macro planners as an engine of growth. The second difference is that the West used the technology diffusion to mitigate the shortage or to utilize the current labor force. I don't want to say that they had a shortage in the labor force, but they used the technology to enhance the productivity of the labor force. On the other hand, developing countries and MENA are viewed and endorsed as a way to relieve the overwhelmed labor markets, and at the same time, they are dismissing any labor productivity or productivity enhancing tools. And therefore, they are operating at two different levels. The third difference is that the small business owners and entrepreneurs have many characteristics in common in the West. They start with an idea, and the idea has a long-term plan, and they have a long-term growth. On the other hand, the small or medium-sized enterprises in the MENA region are very short-lived, and they are not, the purpose of these activities are not for growth, but for surviving day by day. So they are motivated by necessity, not by the entrepreneurship of ideas or having a new product in the market, etc. The fourth difference is gender equality or inequality. Actually, the United States, especially United States, when they started their development process, they were not that different from the MENA region in terms of female labor force participation. In 1940, the female labor force participation rate in the United States was about 25%, which is almost the rate at the MENA country. So what happened to increase or raise this female labor force participation? It was a very aggressive campaign, media campaign from the government for women to step in and take the role of men in the factories. Okay. So in a matter of 5 years, female labor force participation rate increased by 11%. So it was not economic necessity, it was not individual desire. The government actually pushed about 6 million women to join the labor market. Yes, later they told them to go back home, it's time to stay home, but the idea is that they urged that many women to engage in the market. Okay, the fifth difference is that the West had efficient enabling institutions. They had rewarding incentives for small businesses to grow. The MENA region is saturated with small or a large number of tiny, small, or micro prices, especially in the informal sector. Some of the statistics report 17 informal businesses for every formal business in India, which means that we have a hidden contributing sector to the economy that we do not have any account for. And this is one of the main differences between developing or the MENA countries and the developed world. The mushrooming of the informal businesses. So the rise of the formal and informal micro enterprises in the region was also matched by and aided by a rise of informal micro funding institutions. In the last 20 plus years, the micro funding institutions rendered two types: small type of MFI microfinance institutions. These are mostly NGOs, internationally backed by a development agency for the purpose of social development or helping vulnerable and low-income groups. The second type is the microfinance lending window in commercial financial institutions. So to evaluate the link between microenterprises or small and microenterprises and the banking or the funding service, let's look at some of the financial indicators in the region. Depositors and borrowers from financial banks, selected MENA countries. The small arrow, column or bars, the yellow and the orange, they represent the borrowers. Depositors, there are 18, the depositors account for 18% of the adult population in the MENA region. So there are many depositors, but the borrowing level is very shallow. Now moving to the percent of adult population who took a loan from a family or friends versus those who took a loan from a financial institutions. The bars represent males and females taking a loan from a family or friend, and the dots represent males and females taking loans from financial institutions. So the economy or the banking financial sector in the region is still very much dependent on family and friends. And we also notice in the GCC countries, the last few columns at the end, we see larger gender disparity between, especially for those who apply for or take a loan from a financial institution. Next, we look at the domestic credit to private sector regional comparison. So the MENA region is the black line at the bottom. It's even below the sub-Saharan African levels. So that tells us about this is the formal or the commercial funding part of the economy. Access to microfinance funds is also very thin and shallow. Okay? But there is a catch here. All the information or the statistics that come or is available on microfinance institutions come from the mixed market. The microfinance institutions exchange market. And the mixed market requires certain standards to report these statistics. So very few institutions actually share with the mixed market data. So it's still very select groups of financial institutions, and of course it doesn't account for the informal sector. So for the above reasons, we should not be surprised to see that most of the funding that's happening in reality for micro and small enterprises is on the informal side of the financial banking sector. So what's the current status of the sources of finance for microfinancing? Actually, 3 countries in the region account for 85% of all microfinancing activities in the region. These countries are Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan. West Bank and Gaza. The advantage of an informal lending is that it's very accessible, it's very on a short note, but in the same time it charges very high interest rates. Interest rates range between 20% per week to 25% per day, depending on where and the time of the loan. So a good way to judge or evaluate these microfinance institutions is the success in the repayment rates. And the repayment rates, good repayment rates, means that the institution is doing well and the project is profitable. However, compared to a small or a medium-sized funding institution, microfinance institutions or small entities require additional personnel, and this is why they charge higher rate than the average commercial institution. Now let's look at the status of women in the region. First, the legal system in the region considers the family the unit of the society. Okay? And the laws and regulations therefore protect this entity where the man is the breadwinner and the family, for the family, and the woman as the secondary agent in the household. In fact, the region tops the world regions in the number of discriminatory legal treatments by gender. Jordan, Syria, and Yemen stand out as having the most restrictive legal constraints in business-related activities against women. Among the 28 most restrictive economies against women, 25 countries are in the MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa region. MENA countries alone maintain 18 legal constraints against women in business-related activities. So how did the region do with regard to empowering women? The region made 2 successful strides at 2 fronts. First, the promotion of women education and the success in closing the gender gap in education. But they stopped short of taking advantage of this investment. the female labor force participation in the region actually rose by 0.17% in the last 3 decades. And most of the increase happened in North African region versus Middle East regions. North African regions experienced 3% increase in female labor force participation rates in the last 10 years, whereas the Middle Eastern countries experienced 1.6% in the last 10 years. The informal employment sector is becoming the new norm in the region, especially for women. Self-employed women are not the norm in Palestine. Most of the Palestinian women are likely to operate in the informal sector. 85% of private businesses are run informally, and 70% of all wage workers reporting that they operate within the informal business context. In fact, medium and large size enterprises recruit about 25% of their workforce from the informal sector. If we look at the distribution of women in the labor force across the region, 60% of all women found in Morocco, Iran, Egypt, and Turkey. So this is the bulk of working women. And if we look closer at where what sector, it is the self-employed sector that hosts this number of workers. So what makes a businesswoman different from businessmen or the businesses that are run by men? First, women have limited participation in the labor market. They have less experience, etc., and therefore they have less profits. But also they lack, or they have they are risk averse, and this constitutes a deterrent for any financial institutions to fund these types of activities because of the risk averse nature of women. So we have the lack of experience, low profits, lower revenues, as well as the risk averse nature of women. Therefore, female businesses or female-owned businesses are very small, they're very tiny, and the consequences of failing are much greater. This is the graph showing the percentage of the population who are involved in a new business. And we see the differences between men and women. The first few columns for women, different years, and followed by men or males, different years in each country. We have Algeria, Egypt, Iran, etc. So we see the big difference in terms of those who are involved in a new business in operation. The early stage entrepreneurship activity by working age, for the working age population in Egypt, same thing, we have very shallow, very small bars or columns. Okay. So is this an empowerment for women, or is this a survivor type of projects? Short-run benefits are already in the literature, or has been proved or proven by empirical studies. However, the long-run benefits are still patchy, and most of the evidence that comes from developing countries show a negative or disadvantage put on women. For example, a study finds that 80% of women recipients of loans are used to meet household consumption. Empirical evidences from India point to the deteriorating health and well-being of microcredit borrowers of women after their spouses cut their financial and non-monetary contributions to the household. Since she's now working, they cut back on their allowances, etc. So the long-term effects are starting to appear in the literature. Most of the time, it is not a good story. However, we need to know, keep in mind that these surveys actually do not convey the actual trend or the actual story. The region is still very early on in terms of sharing or sharing the contribution, or people are reluctant to share their experience with the institutions in terms of responding to surveys. And therefore, the surveys that are collected do not reflect the entire or the actual story. There is a non-response issue and there is a non-compliance issue. So we have to keep this in mind whenever we evaluate these statistics. The culture of sharing experiences is not popular in the region, and this is especially noted in GCC countries. And that's why we have very low evidence from the GCC countries. The situation is going to get worse because many countries now are trying to cap the interest rate on those financial institutions, which will limit the interest, the funds or the amount of funds available for especially women. So in conclusion, the micro and small enterprises business owners in MENA, they do not fit the entrepreneur definition. Most of the businesses are for surviving day-by-day activities, and the business structure is not institutionally promoted. It's not rewarded in the system. Financial institutions are still underdeveloped, and the legal system is still not conducive in promoting women in the labor market. Plus, the connection between microcredit and improving the standards of living has not been very favorable in the last few empirical studies. So we need more short and long-term studies of the microfinance institutions programs to identify different programs, or to distinguish between different programs that for the purpose of alleviating poverty versus programs that are there for the purpose of women controlling their own resources or ability to control their own resources. Access to funds is different from controlling those funds. Access to funds programs have been successful, but controlling those funds have not, programs have not been successful. Thank you.